I work for the Comité d'Action de Parc-Extension. We're a group based in Parc-Extension that supports tenants in accessing better living conditions and fighting for decent, affordable housing. Sometimes this looks like providing information about different housing rights and recourse to tenants, to writing letters, and accompanying folks through the Tribunal Administratif du Logement. Sometimes this looks like organizing workshops and other popular education events. Other times it'll look like organizing demonstrations, creative actions, as well as occupations and disruptions. So CAPE was created actually in 1986. At the beginning it worked more broadly to address questions of poverty and broader living conditions, and then over time took more of a focus around housing. We've also seen the nature of our work change a lot more recently. In the past, we used to work a lot around housing conditions. Parc-Ex tenants tend to deal a lot with the consequences of exploitative employers, an unjust immigration system, and negligent landlords. And many were facing questions, for example, of negligent landlords, of problems of mice, cockroaches, mold, and landlords who refuse to fix it. More recently, however, we've seen that shift along with the increasing gentrification of the neighborhood. This happened as a result of both the University of Montreal implanting its campus in the south of the neighborhood, as well as because of the gentrification of the surrounding areas as well. Many tenants these days are facing abusive rent hikes, evictions, repossessions, as well as a lot of harassment and pressure that seems to be very much aimed at forcing out long-term tenants and sometimes doubling the rent. For many tenants, it often means being forced out of the apartments that they lived in for a long time that were affordable to them. The context of housing has really changed a lot in the neighborhood. Apartments that used to rent for maybe $600-700 a month are now $1,200-1,300. There's also an enormous amount of housing discrimination we see in the neighborhood, and it tends to target immigrant tenants, poor people of color, and families the hardest. Many are really struggling to find affordable housing in the neighborhood and even elsewhere in the city, like where it used to be that maybe people could find other apartments in sort of the peripheral areas of the city, but now we're seeing repossessions in Montreal Nord, rent evictions in Cartierville, and even entire buildings getting emptied in places like St. Leonard. It really raises the question, like, where are people going to go? We're very worried that we're going to be seeing a real exodus from the neighborhood this summer and in the years to come. We also are very concerned that it'll end up changing the character of the neighborhood as a whole. While Parc-Ex is a neighborhood that deals a lot with the consequences of systemic racism and precarity, it's also a place where immigrants have built long-term networks of solidarity, and we're really worried that that's going to be threatened as more and more people are forced out of the neighborhood. One thing we're hoping to do more and more of is organize within buildings, to go door to door, to meet with tenants, to organize meetings between tenants of different buildings, to talk about the problems they're facing and to organize collectively around them. We're also increasingly hoping to organize meetings between tenants of different buildings in order to build relationships of solidarity between tenants in the neighborhood. We think this is important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because sometimes the Tribunal Administratif du Logement, it can address some things, but there are some things that it doesn't really address well, specifically harassment, specifically threats and intimidation. In addition, we get the impression that in a lot of instances, landlords kind of bank on the presumption that tenants will just go quietly, that people won't know what their rights are, that people will sign agreements and agree to conditions that are really, really not in their interests, and that they'll just be able to empty buildings relatively easily. And we're hoping that if there is an organized pushback against that, it might discourage gentrifying landlords from using these kinds of tactics. Because I'd say first and foremost that they pay off. We've seen a number of buildings, for example, where tenants have come together and have fought, and for example, the landlord backed off the renovations and people are still there. In other instances where tenants went public and organized demonstrations and spoke out about the conditions they were facing, the landlords backed off in terms of harassment. So what it sometimes means is, in very real terms, that people are able to stay in their homes and stay in the neighborhoods that they love and that they call home. I'd also say we've seen a number of victories specifically around social housing in the last few years. For example, there's been the recent acquisitions of 7965 Acadie, the old factory at Bétonel, and then more recently the defeat of a condo project at 700 Jarry. Obviously, these victories won't stop gentrification in and of themselves, but what I do think they demonstrate is that there are real gains to be made when tenants come together and fight. There's a certain amount of attrition that'll happen over a while. It's a question of where people, of having a roof over your head, of having a place to stay. It can generate an enormous amount of stress for people. So for example, over time, for instance, people will maybe decide to move out. People will maybe decide to accept deals. I think the real strain involved in, dealing with a high pressure situation, especially in situations where maybe you didn't organize before, you're organizing because your survival is very much connected to it, is that it generates an enormous amount of stress, and sometimes this will mean conflict with your neighbors, and sometimes these things can take a toll in mobilizing over time. I mean, I think in terms of how we try to deal with this, remembering first and foremost that relationships are key to organizing, that first and foremost we need to be there for people, we need to be supporting supporting tenants and our neighbors in fighting these struggles, and be consistently there for people over the long term.